Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. The aim of this series is to give you all the knowledge that you need to get started with your flying in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Part 1 will be aircraft familiarisation. Part 2 will look at the engine start and the taxiing procedure using the real-world aircraft checklist. Part 3 will be the takeoff. Part 4 will look at level flight and manoeuvring in the aircraft. Part 5 we will work on the landing. Part 6 we will fly and discuss the traffic pattern. Part 7 will be a flight planning exercise. And then Part 8 will put everything together that we've learned so far with a full VFR navigation exercise. Anyway, with that out the way, let's now head to our home airfield for the next 8 lessons. So the airfield you can see in front of you is Mount Ida Municipal Airport, otherwise known as BERS Airport. And the ICAO designation is 7 Mike 3. It's located on the southwestern edge of Lake Washita, in the western area of the state of Arkansas. As you can see, it's a nice little airfield, just a single runway, heading of 0826, and it's where we'll be spending the next 8 lessons. Anyway, now that we've seen the airfield, let's head over to the aircraft. The aircraft that you can see in front of you is the Cessna 152. The 152 is an American 2-seat fixed tricycle gear general aviation aircraft. It has a 110 horsepower engine and it's primarily used for flight training. As I mentioned, I have flown the Cessna 152 myself during my private pilot license training. It's a great little aircraft, very nice stable platform, and as such should serve us well over the course of the next 8 lessons. Anyway, let's now jump into the cockpit of the 152 and get ourselves familiarised with the aircraft. So here we are in the cockpit of the default Cessna 152, and we'll do a quick familiarisation tour of the cockpit, discussing all the instruments and systems that we have available to us in this aircraft. So starting in the top left hand corner, we have the aircraft's airspeed indicator. The speed in the aircraft is measured in knots, which is nautical miles per hour. And the speed it's showing us is our indicated airspeed, so that's the speed of the aircraft passing through the air. Below that we have the aircraft's turn coordinator, otherwise known as the turn and slip indicator. Essentially this is 2 instruments in one. At the top we have the aircraft itself showing us our rate of turn, not too relevant for VFR flying. And then below that we have the skid and slip indicator, which allows us to see if the aircraft is skidding or slipping, particularly whilst we are turning the aircraft. We'll cover that again later on in another tutorial, but basically the indication, as you can see, is very much like a spirit level. And very much like a spirit level, the aim of the game is to keep the black ball centered within the 2 bands of the dial. Next we have the parking brake. That's very much the same as the handbrake in your car. That just allows us to keep the aircraft brakes on without having to constantly keep pressure on the pedals. Below that we have our fuel primer. This allows us to inject fuel directly into the engine's cylinders and helps us when starting the engine, particularly if it's the first start of the day and the engine is cold. Coming back up to the top we have the aircraft's artificial horizon. You can't see right now, we'll cover this more later on in the tutorials, but this instrument allows us to see our aircraft's attitude relative to the horizon. So we have a pitch scale as well as a bank angle scale, and we can use that to fly various pitch and bank angles. Below that we have the suction indicator. That shows us a measurement of the negative pressure or suction provided to the vacuum system, which helps to power some of the aircraft instrumentation. Next we have the aircraft's directional gyro. This is an instrument somewhat like a compass. It allows us to see our aircraft's heading. However, unlike a compass, it doesn't actually point specifically to north. We have to periodically set the directional gyro against the aircraft's compass to give us an accurate reading of our heading. Below the directional indicator is the aircraft's fuel quantity gauges. As you can see, we have a quantity for the left and the right tank. Next we have the alternator and the master switch. The master switch basically turning the aircraft's battery on and off, and the other switch turns the aircraft's alternator on and off. An alternator is somewhat similar to a generator. Basically it provides the electrical power to the aircraft and is driven by the aircraft's engine. To the right of that we have the aircraft's magneto, selector and starter switch. Magneto is again very similar to the ignition system in your car, except in an aircraft we have two separate systems, as well as a start position to energize the starter motor and turn over the aircraft engine. In the middle here we have a clock. That's pretty self-explanatory. Below that we have the aircraft yoke or control column. That allows us to control the aircraft's elevator and ailerons, but we'll talk more about that later on. And then down below the main panel we have the aircraft rudder pedals. That allows us to control the aircraft rudder as well as steer the aircraft on the ground. Again, we'll discuss all the flight controls in later tutorials. Coming back up to the top we have the altimeter. This allows us to see the aircraft's altitude relative to the pressure that we have set on the instrument. It's a little bit complicated to explain various different pressure settings right now. Just to simplify things, basically all you need to know is we have to set a specific pressure on the instrument, and then that will tell us how high we are above that specific pressure reference. So typically we'd either set QFE, which is referencing the altimeter to the aerodrome elevation. To do that we can basically just zero the altimeter. And now we have QFE set, and any altitude that we read off this instrument will be relative to ground level at the aerodrome. Otherwise we set QNH. Typically we'd either get the QNH from air traffic control, from an ASUS, which is basically an automated weather report, or we'd have previously looked up the QNH during our pre-flight planning. Also, if you know the aerodrome elevation, then you can use that to help set a rough QNH. And within the flight simulator you can also press B on the keyboard to instantly set the QNH on the altimeter. Below the altimeter we have the aircraft vertical speed indicator. That gives us our vertical speed in feet per minute. Each increment is 100 feet, and we have either climbing or descending. Worth noting that this instrument, it doesn't give you an instantaneous readout. There is some lag in the instrument. To the right then we have two VOR indicators, VOR1 and VOR2. We won't discuss these too much now. The VORs are more related to instrument flying, although it is perfectly acceptable to use them for visual flying as well. Basically we can tune using the radios a ground-based radio navigation beacon, and these instruments allow us to see our position relative to the tuned beacon. Next we have the engine oil temperature and oil pressure. They're used to check that the oil system is working correctly, providing lubricating oil to the engine, and also give a good indication of the general running condition of the engine itself. Below that we have a host of various light switches. So we have the dome light, which basically just lights up the cockpit itself. We have the pitot heat switch, and that turns on an electrical heating element in the aircraft's pitot probe to prevent any ice from blocking the tube. The pitot probe is the probe that we use to measure the aircraft's airspeed, so it is quite important to keep that unobstructed from any ice. The navigation light switch, that turns on two lights, one on each wing, a red light on the left wing and a green light on the right wing. That's used to help other aircraft identify our position relative to them. The strobe light are flashing white lights that you'll see on either wing. They're used basically when the aircraft is in the air and help to make the aircraft easier to observe, particularly at night time. The beacon light is a flashing red beacon on the top of the aircraft. We turn that on just before starting the engine. That allows the ground crew and any other people nearby to see a clear indication that we are about to start the engine, and also makes it more visible during all phases of the flight that the engine is running. Next we have the taxi light. That's basically like the headlights in your car. We use that when we're taxiing around the airport just to help illuminate the taxiways. And the same for the landing light. We have that on for the takeoff and the landing. And again, it's similar to a headlight. It just helps to see where we're going, particularly at night, and also helps once again to make the aircraft more visible when we're in the air. Next to that we have the elevator trim wheel. That's used to adjust a tab on the aircraft's elevator, and it helps us to reduce control loads when flying the aircraft. Again, we'll discuss more about that once we're in the air. Essentially we can just trim that up or down and it will help adjust the loading on the control yoke, which we talked about a second ago. Just above that we have the carb heat. That basically, without going into too much depth, the fuel is provided into the engine of the 152 via a carburetor. And the way that the carburetor works, it actually reduces the temperature of the air passing through it. So if you are flying in relatively cool conditions with any moisture in the air, then the carburetor is quite prone to icing up. So when we're running the engine at low power settings, we can turn on the carb heat, which takes heat from the engine exhaust, puts it into the carburetor, and helps to prevent the carburetor from icing up. The only downside to this control, it does actually reduce the power output from the engine when in use, and if used at high engine power settings it can actually cause damage to the engine as well. Next we have our radio stack. Again, we can discuss this more in later stages, but we basically have 2 communications radios and 2 navigation radios. The communication radios we use for talking with air traffic control, and the navigation radios we use to tune the VORs that I mentioned earlier on. We also have a host of selectors across the top, so we can select either various microphones on various radios or both. The same for the navigation radios, we can listen out to their identifying frequencies. Below that we have the aircraft's transponder. The transponder is basically a radio that will send an identifying signal in response to air traffic control interrogation from radar. So we have 4 selectors. We can select a number from 0 to 7 on each of the 4 selectors, therefore giving our aircraft a unique discrete code and helping air traffic control to identify our particular aircraft. It will also, if selected, we can send our altitude information to air traffic control as well. Next we have the throttle. This controls the power of the engine, and as the aircraft has a fixed pitch propeller, which means that we can't adjust the pitch of the propeller blades, the throttle will also directly control the engine RPM. Next to that is the aircraft's mixture control. That essentially controls the amount of fuel going into the aircraft's carburetor and hence into the engine. Usually we'll be flying around with full mixture, however we can lean the mixture, which is essentially reducing the amount of fuel going into the carburetor. There is an ideal ratio between the air and fuel going to the engine, and as we climb the aircraft the air becomes less dense, and so we need to reduce the amount of fuel going into the carburetor to compensate for that and allow the engine to produce maximum power. To the right of the mixture control we have the flaps. This lever basically allows us to select various degrees of flap on the wing of the aircraft. That allows the wing to produce more lift and therefore allows us to take off and land at slower airspeeds. It also allows us to fly at a given airspeed with a increased nose down pitch, therefore increasing visibility, particularly for the landing. After that we have a couple of cabin air controls. More specifically we have the cabin air and the cabin heater. Not too relevant to flight simulation obviously. Coming up we have the engine RPM gauge. As I said, the engine RPM directly controlled by the throttle in the case of the Cessna 152, and also you'll see somewhat related to the aircraft's airspeed. To the right of that we have the ADF, or automatic directional finder. Again, another radio navigation aid that we can tune in the aircraft, in this case using this radio, and it will show us our relative position to the ground-based navigation aid. Again, not anticipating using that too much in this particular tutorial series. To the right of the ADF we have the aircraft's ammeter, and that allows us to check the charge on the battery of the aircraft, so we can see if the battery is charging or losing charge, and that will give us a clear indication of whether or not the alternator is providing power to the battery. Below that we have the ADF radio, as I just mentioned. We use this radio to tune the ground-based navigation aid to allow us to navigate with this instrument, as I said. Last but not least, we have the fuel shutoff valve. Currently it's in the open position, but we can turn it off to completely shut off the fuel to the aircraft's engine. So that's a very brief overview of the default 152. We'll leave the video here for today, and we'll come back in part 2 of the series for the startup and the taxi out to the runway. So there you go guys, hopefully you're now a little bit better acquainted with the Cessna 152 and its systems. As I said, we'll come back in lesson number 2 for the startup and taxi of the aircraft using the real world checklist. I do hope that you found the video informative and useful. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. That really helps the channel to grow, and I really appreciate the support. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, thanks very much, and I'll see you all again soon.